Oli here, and this is my review of the Caves of Androzani, the sixth story of the 21st season of classic Doctor Who, starring Peter Davison in his final regular appearance as the Fifth Doctor. The Caves of Androzani is 4 parts long, is the 136th overall, and is written by Robert Holmes, who finally makes his return to Doctor Who after 6 years of being away from the show. Please bear with me because I have really bad hay fever and it's really catching up to me now, so if I sniffle, it's because of that. So the plot of the story is as follows. On the cave-riddled world of Androzani Minor, the Doctor and Perry inadvertently find themselves enmeshed in the war fought between the ruthless General Chelak and the sinister Sharash Jek and his army of androids. The duplicitous politician Morgus wants Chelak to execute the time travelers as spies, while the disfigured Jek to keep Perry forever hostage within his stronghold. But the Doctor soon realizes even a more gruesome fate awaits them. They have been affected with the fatal Spectrox toxemia and there's no cure. Haunted by both factions with death just hours away, how far must the Doctor go in order to save his friend's life? So that is the plot of the Caves of Androzani. So, the Caves of Androzani. What a phenomenal story, and this is an example of how to write an iconic story for Doctor Who, and I would say that this is one of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever made, and possibly the greatest story ever made, and is definitely one of the greatest, best regeneration stories ever, if not the very best. I would say that it's actually strange how Caves of Androzani doesn't actually close the season, because closes the season is Colin Baker's first story, The Twin Dilemma. And the production of the story, I think, was very well done. I really liked the set and how it pretty much contrasted with one another, as the caves the caves compared to Morgus's office was a very jarring contrast, because obviously you have Morgus's office, which is Androzani Major, and it was very clean and modern in comparison to the caves, which was very run down and just danger lurking everywhere. Right, and I definitely had to do with the main theme of the story as well, which I'll get to in a moment. The location filming was quite good. I liked the quarry that represents Androzani Minor, and it beautifully captured how the need for survival the story was aiming for was very desperate, and especially with the scene when the Doctor, who was in part 4, when the Doctor who was pretty much suffering the worst of the Spectral toxemia, and he's basically trying to outrun the gun runners, and he's basically getting shots left, right, and centre. And the Doctor's literally just struggling on the ground, just trying to get back to the caves. The special effects were quite cool, especially the Doctor's regeneration. It was very trippy to the point where it probably would have given someone an epileptic fit if they had all of those. The action scenes were great, especially the final fight between Sharash Jek and Morgus. And the script was brilliant, as well as the direction by Graham Harper. And this is actually the first story that I think this is actually one of the first Doctor Who stories he's directed. I think he directed other stories in the past as well, so I think this is his first main one. And he was actually the first director to direct stories for both Classic Who and New Who. And I think the plot of the story was superb. Without a doubt, one of the best plots of the Peter Davison era and 80s Doctor Who overall. And I like the overarching political theme. It was very good, and it was basically like the government, or in this case Morgus, controlling both sides of the war for their own means, and how these means turn to tragedies for all parties involved, especially with them fighting over Spectrox, which was a special substance that was actually protect people from Spectrox toxemia. And this story was very dark, and I think Caves of Androzani is probably the darkest Doctor Who story ever done. I think this is because pretty much every single character in this story, aside from the Sixth Doctor, who pretty much appeared at the end after regenerating, had died, and the only character that survived was Perry and another character named Crow Timon, and she was basically Morgus's girl Friday, so to speak. And the darkness and bleakness pretty much benefited the high tension that the story was aiming for, and add the violence on top, and then you probably have, and with this story pretty much makes, which is probably one of the Doctor's most daunting adventure ever, in my opinion. And I think this story had some very memorable moments, which definitely made the story very iconic, especially the cliffhanger for part 1, where the Doctor and Perry were literally about to get executed in front of a firing squad, which was very chilling, which probably made one think, would they actually kill the Doctor off this early into the story? Even though it was pretty much known that he was leaving here, but then would they be willing to kill him off this early? And Perry, who literally just joined the TARDIS in the last, at the end of the last story, would they be killing her? Will be killing her off as well. Even though yes, you had Katerina all the way back in the first Doctor's era, who joined the TARDIS and who pretty much died in the middle of the story after she joined, which was the Daleks' master plan. But that cliffhanger was resolved because the firing squad actually killed android doubles of the Doctor and Perry, and they were saved by Shara's Jack. And then part three's cliffhanger was really good as well. And this is when the Doctor, who was already one foot in the grave, was hell bent on crashing the ship into Androzani Minor, I think it was, or Major, or one of Major or Minor, and then he pretty much locked shots out, and then the Doctor was like very much crazed and was pretty much like almost near the very delirious from spectroscopemia, and the delivery that Peter Davison gave as well was very chilling and very crazed as well, and he was not letting anyone stop him, and then you can see like the craziness in his eyes, like, and the desperation as well, and how it was very brilliantly done. It was very well directed as well. Oh, and there were some other great moments as well, aside from the cliffhangers, aside from the Doctor's regeneration. As I mentioned before, the scene where the Doctor that arrived back in Androzani Minor and he was getting shot by the gun runners, and also you had, I think, the scene when Perry saw Shara Jack's true face and she was terrified, and pretty much found it disturbing. He was pretty much acting as if it was like someone you love, and they just treat you terribly, and that's how it was very much done. And I also like the fight between Shara Jack and Morgus in part four. I think that was brilliantly well done. This was when, which causes Jack to actually reveal how disfigured his face was, and it was quite epic. And also, whilst that's happening, you have the Doctor literally scrambling to retrieve the bat's milk for himself and Perry, and then he was able to get the bat's milk, and Shara's Jack is able to, like, while that's going on, I think where Shara's Jack actually told the Doctor where the bat's milk was, and he was able to get there, and the Doctor pretty much had to carry Perry back to the TARDIS all by himself, whilst the planet was pretty much still imploding on itself, and it was a very well, it was a sequence that was just amazing, and that was the final nail in the coffin for our favourite celery wearing Doctor. I did like Six's first moments, which pretty much established that his Doctor was going to be a very interesting one, so to speak. So on to the acting, which I think it was just brilliant from everyone involved. Peter Davison was superb, and I definitely think that Caves of Androzani is his best performance as the Fifth Doctor, and I think Davison himself would agree, and he really delivered, and I think he said that if he had gotten more stories of this caliber early in his run, he definitely would have actually stayed for a bit longer. I did like the extreme tone change in part one. It was quite quick as well, because in the beginning, when the TARDIS had landed in Androzani Minor, the Doctor and Perry were just literally just bantering amongst themselves, just talking about the surroundings of Androzani Minor, and then that's when the change happened, when the Doctor and Perry fell through this opening, and that's how, and they landed in this very sticky, eggy substance, which turned out to be the spectrotoxemia. And then the Doctor was actually explaining to Perry, because she asked, and we actually do finally get an explanation as to why he carries a stick of celery with him, and he explains that the Doctor's actually allergic to some gases, and when exposed, the celery turns purple, and then the Doctor eats it as some sort of like a relieving agent, which is probably need right now for my hay fever. Spectrotoxemia is a very fatal disease, but then the cure is available by drinking bat's milk, and the Doctor is pretty much trying to find, and that's pretty much his motive for the story, to take for himself and for Perry. And shit did actually hit the fan when he and Perry fell down that hole, which led to his downfall. And then the Doctor actually says that curiosity always led to his downfall, a major bit of foreshadowing for the story. And I did mention earlier how part 3 was memorable, and I think Peter Davison's acting was very responsible for that. As I said before, you can tell how crazed and desperate he was to try and save Perry, and you can really tell that he really wanted to save her. No, I did say he wanted to save Perry more than he save himself, because it was a bit of a foregone conclusion that he was more concerned on saving Perry than saving himself. Also, he is able to get two vials, but then whilst he's trying to get the TARDIS door open, whilst when he finally gets Perry back into the TARDIS, he accidentally drops one of them, and then he decides to give the one that didn't spill to Perry, which pretty much saves her life. So I did admit, although it was, and even though the scene before he actually regenerated was quite good, this is when he actually finally succumbs to spectrotoxemia, and Perry, who makes a very quick recovery, sees the Doctor on the floor, is very concerned about what's going on. That was a very well acted scene. Even Peter Davison was a bit distracted by Nicola Bryant's cleavage, and he even admitted it himself that he was a bit distracted. You can even see her during the regeneration. She was literally like hovering over him, and it was pretty unavoidable at that point, which was quite funny, to be honest. Nicola Bryant, she was good here as well, and I'd definitely say that this story was definitely her best performance as well, which is amazing because one, this is actually her second story, and two, she actually does spend most of the story like very much succumbing to the effects of spectrotoxemia. Although I would say that this story pretty much introduced something called the purification or the Perry effect, and I'll explain what that is in a bit. But Perry was very well written here, as this story she was very vulnerable to spectrotoxemia, and she was very much slowly succumbing to the worst of the disease, which separates her from the Doctor for a good part of the story. Whilst he was busy getting dragged around, escaping from the gunrunners, and almost on his way to Androzani Major to meet Morgus, Perry was in the clutches of Shara's Jack, who was extremely fascinated with Perry's beauty. He wasn't in love with her, but then he was very much in love with how beautiful she looked, which very much contrasts to how disheveled and disfigured he looks. And I think Nicola Brandt definitely captured how terrified she was of Jack, and which obviously did hurt Jack as well because he obviously liked her. And I also liked how Perry was concerned for the Doctor when she was given the loss of the bat's milk, and the Doctor was pretty much going to die and about to regenerate. Yet, and she looked very scared and confused, and especially very puzzled what was going on when the regeneration finished, and the Sixth Doctor was like already like calling her egotistical, and was very much very, you know how the Sixth Doctor is. So onto the side cast, and they're all very brilliant, and I would definitely say these lots are the best side casts you've ever seen in Classic Who. So first off, we have Sharash Jack. He's an android specialist and a rebel. His dealings with Morgus are what actually caused him to have half of his face scarred, or most of his face scarred, so he pretty much has to wear this mask. He really wanted Morgus dead, so he created an android army to gain control of the Spectrox refinery in return for Morgus to be brought to him. He was able to kidnap Salatine and create an android double of him and send the android double to Chelak, whilst the real Salatine remained with him. So Sharash Jack saw the Doctor and Perry and saved them from being executed by Chelak, and was able to put android doubles in their place. Yes, and he was obsessed with Perry because of how beautiful she was and how he was denied beauty, and he was planning on curing her of the Spectrox, so he can actually keep her in his presence. He did actually help the Doctor towards the end of the story by telling him to get the Batsmoke, and while the Doctor was away, he was pretty much having his last battle with Morgus, which Jack won, but he was killed by Stotts afterwards. And I think Sharash Jack is an amazing character simply because how complex he was, and he's definitely one of the most morally great characters we've actually seen on Doctor Who. He was, in my opinion, I think he was misinterpreted as a villain by most fans, and even the DVD blurb actually calls him villainous, but I don't think he's a villain or an anti-villain or an anti-hero. He's just morally great, and I actually do feel bad for him because he was disfigured by Morgus, and he was simply consumed by blind revenge, and he would stop at absolutely nothing. He didn't care about anyone else apart from Perry. He just wanted Morgus dead, and for reasons I'll explain why. And we do see a softer side to him, as he did actually fall in love with Perry's beauty, even though he was very much bordering on Joe Goldberg, like was levels of infatuation, but he did actually care for her. And then we have Stotts. He was a hired gun who was employed by Morgus to legally sell weapons to Sharash Jack. They were a bit late for Jack, and Stotts figured out there was a supply of Spectrox nearby, and he told Morgus. So the Doctor was sighted, and Stotts pretty much told. Morgus was pretty much instructed by Morgus to kill the Doctor and Perry. But then obviously that failed, and that pretty much led up to the final battle between Jack and Morgus, which Morgus lost because Stott was killed by Jack, and Stotts killed Jack, and then Stotts was eventually ended up getting killed by the android Salatine. Then we have Major Salatine. He was an officer under Chelek's armed forces, and he was adopted by Shara's Jack. And whilst the android double whilst the android double was sent to Chelak, the real Salatine was pretty much imprisoned by Jack himself. He met the Doctor Imperial and told him about Spectrox toxemia and was very much mocking them about it in a very crazed way. But he was eventually freed by the Doctor, but then his freedom was very short lived while he was killed by one of Jack's androids. The android Salatine was actually loyal to Jack, and Jack actually ended up dying in the android's arms before the caves pretty much just caved in. And then we have General Chelak. He was sent by Morgus to force out Shara's Jack. He and his men captured the Doctor Imperial and acted on orders by Morgus to execute them, but they ended up accidentally killing the android doubles that was replaced by Shara's Jack right under their noses. So after that, he pretty much was taking orders from Morgus, and then he meets a very gruesome end. He sees Jack's disfigured face and becomes so horrified by it. He actually runs into a mud burst and pretty much kills them instantly. And then we have Timon. She was Morgus' assistant. She obeyed pretty much every command and job that he wanted to do, but it turns out that she hated Morgus and she was actually gathering information from him. And then before the end, she actually does blindside him by reporting him to the government and escaped, and she herself became the chairwoman of the Sirius conglomerate. She was one of the two survivors of the story, the other survivor being Perry. And then we also had Krelpa. He also worked for Stotts, and he was known for being very impatient. He and Stotts wanted to try and take the Doctor to Morgus, but this backfired when he was killed by an android. And finally, we have the President. He's actually one of the characters that wasn't really morally grey, so to speak. He was the president and the leader of Androzani Major. He was very well liked and felt that the order to execute the Doctor and Perry was uncalled for, as more information could be gotten from them. But he didn't know that Morgus was actually doing some stuff behind his back by supplying weapons to Shara's Jack, and he was killed by Morgus when Morgus pretty much pushed him from a lift shaft, and he pretty much fell to his death. And we have our big bad of the story, Morgus. So Morgus was the chairman of the Sirius conglomerate and was very power, money hungry, and he decided to strike a deal with Shara's Jack to try and help refine the Spectrox so he can try and give people more protection from Spectrox toxemia. And he sold Spectrox at a very inflated rate because he wanted all the profit for himself, and he didn't really want to be partners with Shara's Jack, so he caused an accident in which he hoped that would actually kill Jack, but then he actually survived from it, and pretty much this is what caused Jack's disfigurement. Whilst Jack took over Androzani Minor with his android, holding some Spectrox captive until he had Morgus brought to him, Morgus hired Stotts to sell Jack some weapons so the war between the two can actually continue, and the imbalance of the demand and supply of Spectrox toxemia can actually continue, so he can continue charging them at a higher rate. So in the interim, he decided to ruin the economy of Androzani Major by pretty much shutting down working factories, causing workers to take jobs at labor camps, and subjected them to what was essentially slave work. He thought that the Doctor and Perry were spies, right, and had them executed, but then that failed. He thought that they were pretty much spies for the president, and were pretty much a part of his investigation, but then he ends up killing the president and that was not the case as well. So he convinced Stotts to go to Androzani Minor to get the remaining Spectrox after Timon had actually reported him and she had taken control of the Sirius conglomerate himself. Morgus was killed by Jack in the end, and I think Morgus is a very good villain, and it was a great villain to be precise, and I loved how extremely evil and extremely selfish this man was, and because of this I think he is devoted as one of the most evil villains in Doctor Who history, because he was so blinded with power. He would stop at anything. He wouldn't stop at anything to ensure he gets that power by any means possible, even disfiguring business partners or ruining people's economies, ruining people's lifestyles, so to speak. And I think his own being so lost in his beliefs pretty much led to his downfall. And I suspect he was a form of a metaphor for the US President Ronald Reagan, who was quite similar to Chavez Jack, well not as such, but I think he definitely ruined economies, and also he was also kind of linked to the British Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher. So onto the faults of the story. I don't think there were some, but they didn't really hinder the story. And I would say that they're more nitpicks than faults. First being the magma beast, it didn't really serve much purpose to the plot other than just create the danger for the part 2 cliffhanger. Even though the beast did kill a few gun runners before ultimately dying at some point in part 4. Also, another fault, I feel as if the plot twist of Timon randomly betraying Morgus came out of nowhere, and there wasn't even a hint or two showing that she actually disliked him. She did feel very one-dimensional. It just felt a bit random, so to speak. So I did say that this story was pretty much responsible for the creation of the Perry effect, or Perrification, and this is where villains or other characters become too fascinated with Perry in a very creepy way, and obviously should be getting captured as well, and that's how she'll be subjected to this fascination, to people just perving on her. So I think this part of this is also another part of the troop is having Perry go through hell and obviously getting perved on by these enemies or other characters. I think this trope actually does exceed the damsel in distress that we've actually seen in Doctor Who before with other companions, but I think this one is more extreme because it definitely happens to Perry the most in comparison to other companions. So Perry is very synonymous with having all these terrible things happening to her. It doesn't really help that Perry herself can be a bit vulnerable at times, but in this story, she does suffer the worst effects of spectral toxemia, and you have Chavez Jack acting all very much Gollum towards her. And as much as this story was successful for Doctor Who, it also was pretty much responsible for what kind of brought down season 22 and the Colin Baker era overall. In general, the Caves of Androzani was pretty much a blueprint for some stories like Vengeance and Vows, even though that was a very good story, but you can tell there was some influences of Caves of Androzani still felt in that story, which was full of dreary world, dreary people suffering under like some sort of regime, or so to speak, with a very dangerous main villain, and obviously it was quite violent and very violent as well, with very high body counts of death. And when it felt as if John Nathan Turner was trying to replicate the success of this story, but it really wasn't. It wasn't really the same. But although we did get we did get Robert Holmes back for a few stories before he died in 1986. So it's farewell to the Fifth Doctor. After getting infected by spectral toxemia in the beginning, he spends most of the story fighting the disease before ultimately succumbing to it at the end. Despite retrieving the bat's milk for himself and Perry, he accidentally drops one vial and gives the last one to Perry, which was a very heroic gesture. Probably one of the most heroic gestures from the Doctor in the classic series. And then he pretty much, as soon as Perry recovers, he pretty much just collapses on the floor and is pretty much nearing the end. And he tells Perry that it's time for him to go, and things feel different this time. And it feels as if he's going to die. And then you have companions from his era, Tegan, Turlo, Nissa. Oddly enough, they decided to put Chameleon there for some odd reason, and Adric. They're all pretty much telling the Doctor that they shouldn't die, and then when the Doctor envisions Adric, the Doctor actually calls out his name, which ended up being his last words. And so this was a vision, and they're all pretty much saying the Doctor that he shouldn't die, and then you have the Masters just pretty much egging the Doctor, saying, "No, my dear Doctor, you must die, Doctor, die, Doctor, die, Doctor," and it's just this craziness, and then obviously the Master laughing, and all this trippy effect comes in, and then they're pretty much takes over the screen, and there's a loud boom, and that's how the Colin Baker becomes the Doctor. His first line was quite amazing, to be honest, and he says at the end, "Change my dear, it seems not a moment too soon," and then he smiles at the camera, and then it's his face in the title sequence now. And I liked how the Fifth Doctor's regeneration actually contrasts with the Fourth Doctor's regeneration, because the Fourth Doctor's regeneration, even though it was very similar, but then the Fourth Doctor's regeneration was more peaceful, because he did live a long life, and then despite facing some very dreary enemies, when the Fourth Doctor was about to regenerate, it was as if someone important was dying, and then but with the Fifth Doctor, it didn't feel like that at all. Even though yes, he was still important, but it was a very traumatic scene, so to speak, because the Fifth Doctor did have a very traumatic life because Four was remembering his companions as well and looking back at them with pride, or but then the Fifth Doctor was pretty much envisioning his companions, and they were telling him not to die as well. Well, even though the Fourth Doctor died in horrible ways when he fell off that telescope thanks to the Master, the Fifth Doctor's death was even more horrible than the Fourth Doctor, so to speak. Which is why he says it feels different. The Fifth Doctor says it feels different this time because it's my theory that the Fifth Doctor's regeneration was so traumatic that it would pretty much cause the Sixth Doctor's character to be very volatile and very temperamental for most of it, because spectral toxin pretty much affected the Doctor's mind state as well in his earlier stories, but then he pretty much gets over that quickly. So yeah. Peter Davison was a brilliant Doctor, and I liked how he was able to capture how human he was in comparison to other Doctors. As someone said in the video, that it said in, I think, that TV show Chris Chibnall appeared in as a teenager, that when they were criticizing the writing of Doctor Who, one of the audience members said that the Fifth Doctor had this innocence, recklessness to him, and I actually do agree, because the Fifth Doctor had this innocence to he was very naive, but he was quite reckless as well, because how many times in the story where the Doctors pretty much have trying to fix the TARDIS, or he couldn't get Tegan back to Heathrow for 3 stories, and things were just going wrong in this story. And yeah, and I think Peter Davison had a great deal of responsibility on his hands, as he was pretty much coming after Tom Baker, who spent 7 years on the role, and obviously Colin Tom Baker had already cemented his legacy as one of the greatest Doctors ever. And I think Davison delivered on that, in my opinion. He did a good job trying to carrying Tom Baker's legacy, and even creating a legacy for himself, because Peter Davison actually inspired David Tennant to become an actor and become the Doctor himself, which is ironic because Peter Davison is actually David Tennant's father-in-law in real life. Even though his acting may not have been as strong compared to other Doctors, but he did an amazing job. And even though the quality of the stories in his era were very hit or miss after season 19, but I do think Peter Davison delivered on some stories, and it showed in the stories like Earthshock, Snake Dance, Five Doctors, Resurrection of the Daleks, and of course this story. And I've always said in the past that the Fifth Doctor had a story arc of his own, but it was very discreet because most of the stories in his era were very plot driven and with some character driven storylines as well. And obviously, the story arc being the Doctor dealing with Adric's death and the relationship the Fifth Doctor had with his companions. So obviously, Adric's death was very tragic, and the Doctor obviously felt guilty over it because he couldn't do anything to save Adric because the Cybermen had pretty much damaged the TARDIS controls, so he wasn't able to go back to save him. So whenever if Tegan, Turlo, or Nyssa were in great danger, the Doctor did everything in his power to prevent them from falling into even further danger, like dying, so to speak. An example of this was in Snake Dance when the Mara had Tegan in a literal chokehold, and the Doctor was doing everything he could to try and save her. So which she actually does, and he was pretty much warning us about the dangers of Terminus when she wanted to stay, but then she insisted that she knows the dangers and she can protect herself, which the Doctor actually admired, and that her trying to help them. And obviously, the Doctor was trying to redeem himself from not being able to save Adric. So when he was able to save Perry by giving her the bat smoke, I think that's his way of this was him redeeming himself and was pretty much fulfilling his purpose, and it was definitely time for him to go, despite having a very rocky regeneration. So Peter Davison's era, despite being quite short, he did leave an impact on the legacy of Doctor Who. As I said, he did inspire David Tennant in becoming the Doctor himself, and I will definitely miss seeing the Peter Davison era. And it was when he appeared again in The Power of the Doctor, the centenary special of the BBC. It definitely put a great big smile on my face, especially when he was with Tegan. So that brings us to a close to the Peter Davison era, but not season 21 because there's still one story left, which is the Twin Dilemma, which is Colin Baker's first story, so look out for that. Thanks for watching this review. Please let me know your thoughts of the Caves of Androzani and this review. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.